Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Deep Dive. My name is Crispina Robert, and I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Chia. Hi, Steve.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
Hey.
Okay, so you travel quite a bit for work too, right?
Yeah.
Tell me,
Yep,
what's
that's
your
right.
biggest fear about traveling?
That I have to fly budget. No, I'm kidding. The comforts of life, because we always fly budget.
So privileged.
But no, yeah, no. I mean, it's when you're on a plane that doesn't feel very safe.
What do you mean?
Sometimes for whatever reason you hear things in the plane which are a bit clinky, and you start thinking, well, this seatbelt doesn't really click so well. It makes me a bit fearful of that journey that I'm taking.
Okay.
And of course, turbulence is one of those too. When the plane's rocking, I mean, nobody feels safe in that kind of environment.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not really good with flying. I have anxiety and it flares up. So for me, right, if I were on that flight SQ321, which is the reason why we're talking about this today, I think, I would have literally just, died of anxiety first before any injuries.
I think everyone knows about this story now, and they'll probably have seen some rather horrific images and videos of what happened on that flight from London to Singapore that happened on the 21st of May. It hit severe turbulence, made an emergency landing in Bangkok. One passenger died and dozens others were badly injured.
Yeah, so today we're going to discuss the rather complicated issue of airline compensation. Who decides how much to pay out when something bad happens? Why do people hire lawyers, for example? And when do they decide that they want to go to court? Can you negotiate for more money, without actually going to court? So, these are some of the things we want to discuss today.
Yeah, and we've got some legal folks with us to help us answer those questions. This recording is also happening online because since we're in the aviation sector, these guys kind of don't stay put in one country. So both our guests are overseas at the moment.
On a recent flight out of KL, we had already boarded, and then the pilot basically said, Changi is not accepting any more flights in because there's a severe thunderstorm. So the flight took off something like 2 hours later. So it wasn't very long, actually. But, delays happen all the time, and we can't, expect airlines to be compensating for every little thing, right? So my first question is, what is compensation territory, and what gets you a voucher, a food voucher, and a hotel room? Maybe, Paul, you want to start?
Oh, sure. In terms of compensation territory, at the high end, obviously, it's bodily harm and property damage. And here we're talking about people who are on board or within an area that's within the control of the airline or the air operator. In terms of what can you get compensated when you're within this location, actually, there are international conventions that deal with it because aircraft obviously flies around the world. The laws in each country is quite different. The key and the most widely ratified convention is the Montreal Convention. And we'll come back to that in just a while. And then if you come down the scale from bodily harm, death and property damage, there's delays and baggage loss. Now that's more interesting. Obviously, I don't know whether you've read the back of your ticket. There are terms and conditions. So contractually, you have certain rights. That's one. But rights are also imposed on the airline in your favor. So, for instance, if you flew in the US or Europe, there are quite favorable rules in terms of compensation as to how many hours beyond which you should get a meal ticket, you should get money, you should get accommodation. And then
let me jump in there because there is the EU air passenger rights. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct.
Can you give us an example of one or two things that would come under these rights?
Delays beyond a certain number of hours will entitle you from a whole range of things, from food vouchers to accommodation to money. And those are strict, meaning that even if the airline was to show that there is unfavorable weather conditions, that the legislation protects very favorably the passenger.
So even if it wasn't the airline's fault, so to speak, and they would still have to compensate the passenger according to that legislation, right? That's what you're saying.
So in both the Montreal Convention and these other EU and US legislation, there are strict portions and there are portions that you need to prove. And yes, there are strict portions which doesn't matter what the conditions were, you are entitled to a certain amount of recovery or remedy, which is good news for people flying.
If I took, let's say, Air France and I was flying to London, right, it comes under that EU umbrella and something happens on that flight, then then my rights. It doesn't matter what nationality, it doesn't matter, where your original departure was.
There are actually quite complicated rules on that. And the people who used to complain when these rules were set up were low-cost carriers because their chance of having to compensate was the highest. But in fact, the EU legislation was set up to punish low-cost carriers if they didn't make their timing, because they charge low fares and passengers should have at least a minimum expectation as to the flights. Now, as to what about Singapore Airlines flying to EU airspace, or say Air Asia starts to fly, and they used to fly to London, there are parameters that have to apply. How large is the portion of the flight in the EU before it qualifies for the legislation.
Wow, so it does sound a bit complicated, but essentially there is some legislation to try and protect passengers a bit more, as you've mentioned. So Jing Yen, I mean, when we look at this case with SQ, I mean, is it then fair to say that, from what Paul's explained, anything that happens within the airline's control or within the airline's premises, so to speak, they should be held responsible for?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the Montreal Convention provides for a limit. I think right now it's about US 170,000, where the airline has to pay if you prove that you suffered that amount of damages, regardless of whether the airline was at fault. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because when you're sitting on the airplane as a passenger, I mean, your life is literally in the hands of the pilot and his crew, his or her crew.
Right.
There's nothing you can do about anything. So we have been seeing a trend where the compensation amounts have been going up and up in terms of the limit where you don't actually have to prove liability on the part of the airline. It makes it a lot simpler for the passengers. Of course, this doesn't mean that you automatically get 170,000 US dollars the moment something happens to you on the plane. You still have to prove damage. You still have to prove what injury you suffered.
Yeah, I think, Crispy, we should talk specifically about SQ321, because that's the one that everyone knows about now. They paid out quite a handful of money, from full refund of tickets to cash up to $25,000, depending on their injuries. The larger cash payments were called advance payments. Now, we know these are actually goodwill payments. How do airlines typically decide on the amounts? That's what we're curious to find out, right?
Singapore Airlines is a premier carrier, and its reputation is, has to be protected. It is valuable. So a gratuitous payment where people are not asking for it and are paid out. My understanding is 10,000 for minor injuries, and then 25,000, but not. That's just the initial advance payment, as you say, and then it could be more. And then for the person who was deceased, they are discussing what is an appropriate level of compensation. It shows actually to the public that they are concerned about their passengers, and that they are prepared to put the money where their mouth is and compensate them where it's injury that's on their airplanes.
Okay, but in a way, they had no obligation to do so. Are they sort of trying to front load what could be a possible crisis down the line?
So under the Montreal Convention, as Jing Yen mentioned, there is an obligation, a strict liability up to a certain amount of 100 special drawing rights, which is about 170,000 US dollars under the Montreal Convention. So, but you have to prove that loss. Okay, it's not free.
So I don't think it has been very clear SIA's position on whether, let's say for the 10,000 amount, right, they've been offering for minor injuries. I'm not sure whether you accept this, you're not allowed to come back anymore. Is it in full and final settlement of the entire thing? The 25,000 has been referred to as an advance, which doesn't stop you from going to court if you later realize that you did suffer more than that. But if it's the case that the 10,000 is in full and final settlement, then it could be the case where SIA is trying to, let's say, reduce the pool of potential claimants that they would have to deal with.
Are they allowed to do that? Can they say, I'm going to give you X amount of money, but in return, you have to agree to ABC?
Certainly so. I mean, it happens all the time in litigation. And for example, I mean, even you're talking about minor injuries, you still have a full spectrum. Some people may have just suffered bruises, let's say, if they were wearing a seatbelt.
Right.
You get $10,000 for that. You know, you
Okay.
probably will take it. But of course, whoever's in
Yeah.
doubt, whether if you suffered something more serious than that, and SIA says that's a minor injury, or if you want to take legal advice before agreeing to anything, it will always come with some sort of document or agreement to sign, and should consult a lawyer to look through those clauses if anyone's concerned about it.
Just to add that even the strict portion, which is a limit rather than something that's paid automatically of the proof loss, just remember that when you're proving loss, that amount can be reduced due to contributory actions that you took or didn't take on the plane.
For example, if you did not wear your seatbelt?
Well, if the sign came out, and it sounded like that the seatbelt sign came out, but people didn't have much time to react to it,
Yes.
and you did not put on your seatbelt, and other people did, and other people didn't get injured, that there's still a case to be made that the full amount of your loss may not be compensated. So you do take a risk also going into a claim situation rather than taking money upfront.
I wanted to ask about, physical injuries, I can understand it. And I think that's how airlines kind of decide how much and, how much to give out and all that. But what about mental trauma? Because, when we were reading some of the comments on social media, there was a recent incident of a Qatar Airways plane that was stuck on the tarmac for hours and hours. And it was, in a heat wave, and people were feeling very distressed, etc. And some of them were saying that, they weren't physically affected, but they were quite traumatized by the whole incident. So that's a good option for me to claim?
So it's never been easy to launch such a claim in the Singapore courts, that's for one. And generally speaking, you do need to show some sort of fairly serious psychiatric disorder or harm that has arisen out of the incident, which means going to actually see a psychiatrist and being assessed, and then having a report, and then going through cross-examination in court if that's challenged. So again, it's not all that simple, which is why the current offers by SIA might make sense to some passengers.
Right, I think we're saying even if sometimes you're stuck on the tarmac for whatever reason, it may take 2, sometimes 3 hours, 4 hours, and if the air conditioning isn't working, it's extremely uncomfortable. Is there any recourse for passengers to then say, I'm not happy with this?
Actually, the Montreal Convention and the case law that has taken place excludes non-physical injury. So mental injury, there are cases, and of course, it depends on whether the court that you litigate in recognizes those cases. But there are cases that confirm that mental injury alone is insufficient. But if you have a physical injury that then manifests itself as a mental sort of deficiency or injury afterwards, then that it can be claimed under the Montreal Convention. So in a way, indirectly you could, but you still need to show a physical injury.
So it's not easy.
Yeah, basically find yourself a good lawyer who can help you argue in that grey area.
And a good psychiatrist who will write you a note.
While the Montreal Convention, as you mentioned, does protect us to some extent, it doesn't seem to really cover a lot of the day-to-day issues that passengers may encounter. Is that right, Paul?
When you say day-to-day, you mean delays and lost baggage?
Yeah, the delays, last-minute flight cancellation, especially with the budget airlines. Lost baggage and all that, I think we can look towards insurance to claim. But things which often really disrupt your logistical travel,
Yeah. So I think Montreal Convention is mostly death, injury, and damage to property. And so I think it does cover damage to baggage. So you have some compensation under the Montreal Convention. Then you look to your contract under your carriage contract under the ticket, and also the rules that in the location that you're flying. and then buy insurance, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. No,
Buy
insurance is
insurance.
definitely. But I wanted to pick up on that. You said, and then it depends on the location you're traveling to. So how does it work? If I'm flying out of Paris but into Singapore, which law applies then?
Very good question. And people hire lawyers to figure that bit out.
We got you guys online. That's what you're here for.
I mean, it's not an easy, it sounds like a very easy question to answer, but you just remember how many laws are involved. So, I mean, the aircraft itself has a state of registration in Singapore. I mean, the citizenship of the passenger is one, where they flew out of is one, where they land is another, and then the countries that they fly over. So very often it depends on what is the injury and when it happened.
Yeah.
And then the people around it. I think one thing that people have been focusing on is the passenger and the airline. But frankly, in a litigation case where we've seen elsewhere where there's death and damage, the injured families will try to take action against everybody around it, including the manufacturers as well.
Oh, wow.
And you would have noticed that Boeing was straight in there to investigate the case, because they're incentivized to protect themselves from and because it's always deep pockets, right? Eugene will tell you, you look around for who can compensate you, and then you look for the causes of action. Yeah.
And is it possible for the aviation companies, the industry in a way, the airline, the manufacturer to come together and share the burden, share the load? Jing Yen, what do you think?
No, everybody's out for himself.
I
don't know,
Try
because
and limit damages, right? That's the whole point.
I guess if they volunteer, there's nothing to stop them. But ultimately, it's a question of who can be proved to be at fault, I suppose. I mean, for example, if SIA were sued or an airline were sued in a particular incident, they have the option of bringing in the manufacturer as a third party to contribute to anything that they may be ordered to pay. That's a possibility.
Okay, let's talk about taking an airline to court. Like, what does that entail, right? So one interesting thing, and Jingo, we were talking about this before we started, was SQ006. Actually, to be fair, SIA crashes are few and far between. Okay, touch wood.
Yes.
So the SQ006, the one in Taiwan, was quite bad, right? I mean, 83 people died.
Yeah.
SIA's offer to the next of kin of those who died was US $400,000. But in the end, 40 lawsuits were filed in Singapore, more than 60 in the US. And you're talking about different jurisdictions, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, they settled out of court.
Everything.
What is, so that's another dimension to this, right? I don't take the 400K. I tell you I'm going to sue you, and then I settle out of court. You know what I mean?
And so all of the settlements...
Explain to us how that,
Certainly. So all of the settlements would have come with a confidentiality clause, which is why none of us would know what amounts were actually paid out, because none of the parties are allowed to speak about it. Otherwise, they'd have to pay it back to SIA, right? And obviously, a reason for this would be that, for SIA, it protects them from future speculative litigation, let's say, from plaintiffs who are looking for a windfall. And I mean, when you go back to the question of jurisdiction, you notice that there were lawsuits being filed in Singapore, there were lawsuits being filed in the US. Now, when we as lawyers advise litigants on where to file the lawsuits, there are strategic considerations as well. And there are factors which the courts consider in whether or not to take jurisdiction. So sometimes the same case may be filed in competing jurisdictions, right? The plaintiff may file a claim in one jurisdiction and the defendant may file in another. And that's because the laws of the various jurisdictions may favor either a plaintiff or a defendant in any particular case. But the question of which court will eventually take jurisdiction is a complex one, because the courts look at a whole basket of factors. So then when you come back to the question of settlement, it may also be the case that the passengers who sued in the US and passengers who sue in Singapore, for all we know, they may be getting very different amounts as well.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, you were saying
So
the rules of how it works in the US is a bit different, right?
Yes. So, I mean, in terms of substantive personal injury law, for example, there may be some kinds of heads of claim that the Singapore courts don't award as much as they would in the US and vice versa.
Mm.
So depending on what type of injury you suffer, it may be more advantageous to go
yeah.
to whichever
So
jurisdiction.
it really sounds like what you should do is, well, first get a good lawyer to help figure out what is your best strategic
in fact,
move
you might
forward,
even
and they will recommend.
That's right. And in fact, you might even need to speak to a lawyer in more than one jurisdiction. Because, I mean, as a
Right.
Singapore lawyer, I can only say what Singapore personal injury law is. You might at the same time need to ask a UK lawyer, an Australian lawyer, US lawyer,
Yeah.
what the position in their jurisdiction is.
So I guess for the average person, you're also thinking, at the end of the day, is it really worth it to go through all this effort?
Yeah.
One of it is, I maybe you've offered me a settlement, maybe you haven't, but for me to engage lawyers in different jurisdictions to then fight it over a prolonged period of time against a huge MNC, I'm thinking, is it really worth it? And I guess it depends on how severe your injury or accident may have been, right? Paul, what would you tell people who, in this situation, should I wait to then ask for more? What approach should they take?
Well, and any form of litigation can be long and costly. And if you are relying on the judge to make a decision, there's some uncertainty. So you could have a long and costly litigation and then not get the result you want, because legal system is adversarial, right? A win-lose situation. Now, there's some historical basis to why there are these international conventions, which is actually to protect the resilience of the aviation industry. You don't want airlines to not be airlines just because they could be sued by people who could get injured. And there is some risk in flying, although obviously we're told it's safer than driving on the road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one thing that people don't talk about very much is that as we said before, in the Montreal Convention, there is a strict liability portion, but there's also an exclusivity provision in there, Article 21, which actually protects the airline if they are able to show that they weren't the ones at fault. I mean, there's some technical terms, but essentially they weren't the ones at fault, or it's a third party that caused the injury. So after they pay out the strict liability portion, if they can prove that, technically, for Montreal countries, you cannot then take a separate action. Say you find some cause of action, bring it against the airline and claim for more than the strict liability portion. This is if the airline is able to show that they are not at fault. And this, people don't talk about very much, but frankly, there have been cases in the UK and in the US which affirm the exclusivity of the Montreal Convention to protect airlines. Now, having said that, I've been interviewed before by CNA on the recent Malaysian Airlines MH loss of aircraft and the suits that are brought by the Chinese in China, right? I mean, obviously, they could still bring a case in China, and a judge that is not well versed in international treaties or not well advised could make a different decision. Yeah. But so there's, even for something clear as that, there is still a chance that if you litigate, you could win. But as I said, long, costly, and unpredictable.
And you could lose, basically. That's the bottom line, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we know lawyers are not cheap, so you end up paying more than what you actually even got. So okay, we got to start wrapping things up. So at the end of the day, I guess, there's so many other considerations that have to be taken into account. But we have to ask you, is there a concern that this may also result in one day higher fares for all of us? Because airlines are then going to say, well, I got to buy more insurance, I got to take more protection, I'm going to factor in more risks. Will this then trickle down to the ticket prices we see? Is there a concern there too?
If it really is the case that we are going to see more instances of unpredictable turbulence affecting aircraft, then yes, it's going to be quite inevitable, because you look at the Montreal Convention, you know that airlines are going to be liable for a certain amount. And so if we are going to see more of these incidents, then I don't see costs not rising for passengers.
Yeah, especially when it comes to turbulence, right? Because a lot of reports are saying that climate change is something airlines can't control, right? I mean, an aircraft flying into an air pocket.
And just in the last few days, we've heard of a few other airlines who have hit turbulence as well. While travel is a nice luxury to many, it's essential for some. How would you guys sort of advise people who are now, looking at the situation, thinking, well, how should I approach this as a passenger on my next flight? What should I be looking to do? Paul, you want to go first?
I think I just flew to New York on SQ, and any turbulence, everybody had their seatbelt on. The stewardesses were seated, no food or drinks. So I think choose an airline that has a good safety record. I mean, Singapore Airlines until now had a fantastic safety. That's the first. Secondly, unfortunately, despite I'm not a fan of insurance companies, I think you do need to buy insurance. And on the point about ticket prices going up, it will go up because the cost of insurance will go up. If the insurers have to cover the airlines for compensating the passengers for their injury, death, or damage. And they will have to, because you cannot fly an aircraft without third-party liability insurance.
Yeah.
So insurance will go up, means costs will go up.
Yeah.
So I think buy insurance for yourself and choose a good airline.
Jing Yen?
I think one good thing that has come out of all this is awareness. I mean, as we always say, prevention is better than cure. So, I mean, as for me as well, I came up to Bangkok on a Scoot flight. And same as Paul, the moment the seatbelt sign comes on, everybody's seated, all the food disappears. Nobody dares to go to the toilet. So I think in the past, some people used to not be so concerned about keeping your seatbelt on even after the sign goes off. Now I notice even after the sign goes off, most of us still keep the seatbelt on.
Yeah, so that was the interesting, cultural shift, right, for us, because we're so scared by all the images that we saw, all the blood and all the injuries. It was quite terrible, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so that will change the way we travel. I guess my next holiday will be a drive to Malaysia. Oh wait, no, that's dangerous. I think I'll take a ferry to Batam. Maybe that's another option.
I was just saying, I think statistically, despite all that has happened, airline travel is still the safest travel mode amongst everything else, at least for now.
I actually don't think air travel will reduce. It's just that people on planes will be a little bit more careful
Yes.
and heed the seatbelt sign.
Yeah, which is a good thing overall. Because it so happens, I'm working on a talking point episode now about people who are not wearing seatbelts, but in the car.
I think that's a lot worse.
So that's a different story. Another story for another day.
When you make that claim, the airline won't be able to say contributory negligence. You didn't put on your seatbelt.
Yeah,
so
that's full negligence.
It's true. We don't have a habit of wearing a seatbelt, especially if we're backseat drivers, right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, the rear seats, exactly, in the rear seat. But did you know that actually by law it is mandatory
Oh my God.
to be belted up in all
Breaking
seats
the
in the
law.
car? I know. Okay, anyway, another discussion for another day. Guys, thanks so much for dialing in and sharing your thoughts with us. I think this is one thing we just wanted to shed a bit more light on the issue for all of us who are listening, And yeah, if you're listening in, you have thoughts on this, or the next time you travel, what are you doing more of, less of? Drop us a note, let us know. We would love to have feedback from you as well.
Thank you to both the gentlemen here, and thanks to the team behind the podcast: Tiffany Ang, Janaini Johari, Joanne Chan, Saya Win, and sound mixing by Ken Delbridge. Thank you. Goodbye.